Welcome to this short video on language techniques and hopefully a quick, easy way that will help you remember language techniques, and it will benefit you in a number of different questions. Anything that requires you to analyse language techniques and any task that requires you to remember techniques to put into your writing as well. So on the screen you can see my acronym VAMPSAP. That is an acronym that will hopefully help you remember the techniques, and the way I have ordered the letters in the acronym is also really important. So here we go. So the V stands for verbs. You cannot get a text that doesn't include verbs, so rather than look for all the fancy techniques first, try and remember to think of verbs that the writer may use or verbs that you can use, because verbs will also allow you to include other techniques as well, which I will come to later. So a verb, of course, is a word that describes an action, a state or an occurrence. For example, if it was describing an action, the verb will be sleeping in the sentence she was sleeping. If it was a verb that was describing a state of being, it would be likes in the sentence she likes ice cream. If it was a verb that was describing an occurrence, it would be the wisps of snow became an avalanche. So became is the verb, that is the action, that is the thing that is happening. Okay, so she's sleeping, she's liking, or the snow is becoming an avalanche. Okay, so the verbs are the action, the state of being, or an occurrence, a happening, an event of some kind. Okay, and the next letter in VAMPSAP is A, which stands for adjectives, and we should all know that adjective is a word that describes a noun. So for example, mean would be the adjective in the sentence Scrooge was mean. If we're describing a mountain, we would use terrifying, possibly. The mountain was terrifying. Or we could have the adjective peaceful to describe the landscape if it was the landscape was peaceful after the snowfall. Okay, so adjectives and verbs are at the beginning of VAMPSAP because you will always find those in a text. Okay, so always try and think of verbs and adjectives, because remember, you don't get extra marks for looking for fancy techniques. You get your marks for your fancy ideas, not the fancy techniques. So verbs and adjectives at the start of VAMPSAP for a reason. Okay, the M in VAMPSAP then, of course, stands for metaphor. And a metaphor is a way of describing something by comparing it to something else, something that is common with it, but it's not exactly the same thing. So for example, love is a battlefield. Of course, it's not a battlefield, but it has some similarities with a battlefield, that people get hurt, there will be maybe injuries and that kind of thing. Baby, you're a firework. So describing someone as a firework, somebody of course isn't an actual firework, but they may have similarities to do with the firework, maybe in their personality or the way that they dress, or they may be really loud. Okay, so you think of common features between the two, but there are of course obvious differences. They're not that actual thing. Final example, self-isolation is hell. It's not actual hell. You're not in the pit of hell in amongst all the fire, but there are common similarities between it. Okay, so verbs, adjectives, and now we have metaphor. And the fourth technique, which is a P, stands for personification. And there's a clue in the word as to what the technique is with the word person. So personification is giving an object or abstract thing human actions or living qualities. For example, from Romeo and Juliet, the earth has swallowed all my hopes but she. So the earth can't swallow things, a human swallows things. So this is personifying the earth as if it has swallowed hopes. And another example from Of Mice and Men, silence crept into the room. Silence doesn't have legs, it can't creep. So this is personifying silence as if it was a person creeping into the room. Okay, So giving something that isn't human actions or living qualities. And you will notice earlier I mentioned about verbs. Personification is often created through the use of verbs. So if you notice there, we have swallowed and we have crept, and they are verbs. So verbs are really important because they can also create personification. So if you think of human actions or human qualities created through verbs, you can also then make yourself some personification. Okay, next up in VAMPSAP we have our S, and this stands for our simile, which is to be describing something by comparing it to something else using either the word like or as. So for example, from A Christmas Carol, as solitary as an oyster. He's not an oyster, but he is solitary as it. As hard and sharp as flint. He's not a piece of flint, but he has some comparative common features as flint. He's hard and sharp as flint. And finally, the rain fell like a gift from heaven. So the differences between similes and metaphors is a metaphor you are saying it is that thing, and a simile you are comparing it using the words as or like. So there should always either be the word as or like in your simile. Okay, and our second A in VAMPSAP is alliteration. And alliteration is a repetition of sounds at the start of words near to each other to create an effect. It's not the repetition of letters specifically, but sounds, because different letters can create the same sound. For example, F and PH. They can be at the start of the words near to each other. They don't have to be exactly next to each other. And these are often to create an effect. So it may be the repetition of a soft sound or a hard sound to create a certain atmosphere or tone in the writing. So for example, from Wilfred Owen's Exposure, we have a sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. And a particular name to give to the S alliteration is sibilance, of course. But of course you can just call it alliteration, that will be fine. Okay, and a second technique we have, but I blink and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. So you can see there we have a repetition of a more hard sound, a B sound, and it's not exactly next to each other, they are spread out across the sentence. Okay, and our last P in VAMPSAP stands for pathetic fallacy. There's nothing pathetic about this technique at all. It is about giving human emotions to nature to establish a mood or atmosphere, and the important word here is emotions. So in the examples we have the poignant misery of dawn begins to grow, and we also have the mist sighed a solemn sigh as the moon dimmed in the distance. So the important thing to remember is what's the difference between pathetic fallacy and personification. And pathetic fallacy is all about emotions and nature. Okay, personification isn't necessarily to do with emotions, it can be actions, whereas pathetic fallacy is always emotions that you give to nature. So how does nature feel? And it often then establishes the mood or the tone in the writing at whichever point of your text you are at. Okay, so misery, solemn, not very positive examples. I'm sure there are other ones, but that's English literature for you. So to recap on VAMPSAP, just before we finish, we have verbs, we have adjectives, metaphors, personification, similes, alliteration, and pathetic fallacy. If you can remember those, you can identify them in texts, you can apply them in your writing, you are on to a winner. VAMPSAP. Over and out, kids.